Now this example here, we're using a built-in data set from SP Data. Let's reference one of these spatial data sets that we already have worked with. So let's use the squirrels CSV data. The first thing we're going to do is import it. I would recommend that you pause the video and try importing it yourself. We're going to use CSV, read CSV, and then just reference the data wherever it's saved. So this is where my data is saved. I'm going to run this and import it into our environment. And let's view it, even though we've already seen it. You can see here that it's everything that we've seen before. And the important columns are the X column and the Y column. And we can plot whatever column we want. So we're going to follow the same workflow that we followed for the earthquake data. Let's use the leaflet function. And we're going to use squirrels. Let's go ahead and add some tiles as well. Okay, so again, we have a map of the world, but there's no data for us to work with right now. We're going to do something a little bit different for this map. Instead of using just add markers, we're going to add circle-shaped markers. Because we have a lot of squirrel data and I don't want to use the raindrop shaped markers that we had for the earthquake data. So we're going to add a function, we're going to pipe a function called add circle markers. And we're going to reference the X column and the Y column, using this in the same way that we reference the Latin long here. So X and Y. Let's run that and see what the first map looks like. Okay, so a lot of information. If you've been to Central Park before, you'll recognize this shape. So these are all the locations where people saw squirrels in Central Park. Very cute. Now let's add labels for the squirrels. I'm not going to do pop-ups this time. Let's just do labels. And we don't actually have to convert our labels into a character because I want to work with the age column. So let's just reference the age column and run that. So you can see which ones are adults, which ones are juveniles. We have a juvenile squirrel here. It seems like most of these squirrels were grown up. We have some missing data right here. So that's just another example, another way to create markers for your point data. We can also change the color of our markers. So in this example and the previous example, we used the default marker, which is like this blue toned point or circle. We can change the color based on whatever data we want to present. So I think it'd be interesting to create a color palette and then alter the color of these circles based off of whatever data we want to represent. So in order to do that, we have to outline a color palette and then assign the color palette into our leaflet function. So I'm going to create a title. I'm Canadian, so I put a U in my spelling of color, but you can definitely do otherwise. So the first thing we need to do is create a color palette. So I'm going to create a variable called pal for a palette. We're using a function called color factor. Let's explore that function and see where it comes from. So this is part of the leaflet library, and it allows you to assign some color palette based on different types of data. So if you have quantile data, there's a function for that. If you have continuous data, there's a function for that. We're going to use the color factor function because I want to assign colors based on the squirrel's fur color. So this is the one we're going to use. I'm actually going to copy this function and just copy it into our code. The first thing we need to do is assign a palette. And the palette we can choose from another function called our color brewer. If you're not sure what palette you want to choose, this is a great resource. So we're using the R color brewer library, and then we're going to display the colors using the display brewer all function. If this doesn't work for you, you may need to install the R color brewer library for this to work, but typically if you've installed Leaflet, this should work. So what this outputs is a range of color palettes. This first section is typically useful for continuous data because you have these types of continuous colors, reds, purples, blues, so on and so forth. You also have this bottom section here where the colors are diverging. So you have this midpoint and the colors diverge to one range on the left and a different range on the right. So if you're plotting NDVI where the numbers range from -1 to 1, using this type of divergent color palette would be useful. We are focused on plotting primary fur color. So I'm going to use one of the palettes from this middle section here because the colors are kind of random. It's not continuous. Fur color isn't continuous. So I'm going to pick the dark 2 palette, which is the second from the bottom here. I think the colors are kind of interesting. So let's go ahead and reference that palette in our color factor function. And we have to input the color palette as a string. The next thing we're going to do is highlight or outline a domain. A domain is basically the data that you want to plot. So let's reference the squirrel data set first. And then we're going to plot primary fur color. So let's run this. And that worked. Let's see what it looks like. So it's basically a function. It outputs a function. And it'll tell our leaflet library or leaflet function how to assign colors to our data. So what I'm going to do is just copy this code right here. And we're going to modify it to account for the colors that we created. And the only thing we need to do is add a color argument. And we're going to use the curly dash and then pal because that's the variable we created. So we're referencing the color palette, and then we're going to, in brackets for the pal function, we need to reference the data. So for us, it's primary fur color. So let's run that. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. You can see that our little circle markers now have different colors assigned to them. So some of them are blue, some of them are pink, and I think what we should do is change the label to primary fur color so we can see how the colors are assigned. So I'm going to copy the variable name and put it here, and let's run that again. So we have some markers with no data. The pink dots represent gray squirrels, and the blue, dark blue spots represent cinnamon colored squirrels. So that's how you create a multicolored interactive web map. If you want to save this map for a website or for a web page, all you need to do is export it and save as web page. And you can pretty much just assign it whatever name you want. I'm just going to create a simple title. And then let's open it up on our web browser and see what it looks like. So here it is. This is in my Chrome web browser. It's a great way to include spatial data on your websites. Now let's work with some polygon data.